Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tales of Darkness. This is a place for stories that don't explain themselves. Stories that unfold slowly, that linger close, and that don't stop when the sound fades. I'm telling you right now, watch this video to the end. The final story reveals the most important information, a truth about silence you'll wish you'd never heard. Dim the lights. Stay where you are. And if something around you seems a little strange, don't check it out yet. Just listen. Story 1. The Rules on the Wall. My name is Ethan, and the first thing I need you to understand is that I didn't take the job because I wanted peace. I took it because I wanted distance, and distance makes you believe you can outrun what follows you. But I learned something out there that I can't unlearn. I learned that some places don't just watch the world, they test it, and if you fail the test, you don't get a second try. I arrived with a bag I didn't pack carefully and a head that wouldn't stop replaying old conversations. The road up was quiet, and the silence felt clean at first, like the kind of quiet that resets you, like the kind of quiet that forgives you. And that was my first mistake. I assumed quiet was empty. I assumed stillness meant safety. I assumed isolation meant control. The tower was taller than it looked from a distance, and the moment I stepped inside, I smelled old wood and stale air, and something else underneath it. Something dry and patient, like the room had been holding its breath for a long time. The man who handed me the keys didn't introduce himself the way people usually do. He kept his words short and his eyes moving, like he didn't want to stay long enough for the building to notice him. He pointed at a sheet of paper taped to the wall near the desk. It wasn't new and it wasn't neatly written. It looked handled, creased, rewritten, corrected, like different hands had tried to make the same warning sound reasonable, and he told me to read it carefully, not once, not quickly, carefully, and then he left without asking if I understood. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper. The first lines were simple, the kind of rules you expect in a remote posting. Keep the radio close, keep the door latched, don't leave food out, log your check-ins. But then the tone shifted, and the rules stopped sounding like policy and started sounding like survival. One line said that if you saw someone outside after dark, you were not to open the door no matter how familiar they looked. Another line said that if you heard knocking, you were not to answer it because the tower had a way of repeating sounds that didn't belong to it. And then I read the line that made my stomach tighten, because it didn't tell me what to do, it told me what was already true. It said if she smiles at you, you are already too late. I reread that line again and again because my mind kept trying to turn it into a metaphor, a joke, a superstition, anything that didn't have weight, but the paper didn't feel like superstition. It felt like a confession written by someone who didn't survive cleanly enough to forget. I spent the first day doing normal tasks, checking equipment, learning the angles, watching the horizon, telling myself the rules were exaggerated, telling myself people get bored in isolation and invent stories to keep the nights interesting. And that excuse held together until evening, when the lights started fading and the tower began to sound different, not louder, not creakier, just more aware, like every small shift in the building carried intention. That first night, I kept the paper close, not because I believed it, but because I didn't want to admit I was unsettled. I made coffee I didn't need, and listened to the radio chatter that came in thin and distant, the kind of chatter that reminded you there were other people somewhere out there. And then the radio went quiet in a way that didn't feel like a normal drop. It felt like someone stopped speaking mid-breath. The silence lasted long enough for me to notice my own heartbeat, and then I heard a sound outside, not footsteps exactly, more like weight moving carefully across the ground, slow, deliberate, unhurried, like whatever it was had nowhere else to be. I stepped to the window and looked down, expecting to see an animal, a shadow, a trick of light, something I could label, and at first I saw nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw a movement near the base of the tower, something standing too close to the structure, close enough that it felt intentional. It was a woman's shape, but not in a way that made me relax. She wasn't walking around. She wasn't searching. She wasn't lost. She was standing still like she had been placed there, like she belonged at the edge of the light and was waiting for the light to notice her. My first thought was that she was someone from the service road, someone who needed help, and that thought almost made me reach for the latch until I remembered the rule, the one about familiar faces and doors. So I stayed behind the glass and watched. She lifted her head slowly, and the movement wasn't human casual. It was controlled like a performance, and I felt that old instinct rise up, the instinct that says, look away. Because there are moments when your eyes become a contract. Her face was pale enough to catch what little light the tower gave off, and her hair hung straight down like it had never been touched by wind. And then she did something that made my body go cold, because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, it was gentle. She smiled. It wasn't wide, and it wasn't twisted. It was small and calm, like a polite smile you give someone across a room when you recognize them. And that calmness is what broke me, because it suggested she wasn't hoping I would open the door. She was acknowledging that I had seen her, and that meant the rule wasn't a warning, it was a timestamp. I stepped back from the window immediately and forced myself to breathe quietly. The paper felt heavy in my hand, like it had gained weight now that it applied to me. I told myself not to look again, not to confirm, not to feed whatever reaction she wanted. And for a long moment, the tower stayed silent, almost respectful. Then the knocking started. Not loud, not frantic, measured. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again, like someone practicing patience. And the worst part was that it wasn't coming from the door at first. It was coming from the wall beside the desk, the inside wall, the one that faced the room itself. I froze because the rule didn't mention knocking from inside. The rule didn't mention the tower imitating sound from the wrong direction. And as I stood there listening, the knocks shifted, slowly, like they were moving through the wood, traveling along the structure, the way a thought travels. And then they reached the door. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and the handle did not rattle. Whoever was out there did not try to force it, because forcing it would have been an argument, and this wasn't an argument. This was routine. I backed away from the door and kept my eyes on the paper. My mind tried to focus on the practical rules, the normal ones: latch the door, keep the radio close, log your check-ins. But my body kept returning to that line about the smile, because the smile had already happened, and nothing I did now could undo it. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it started, and the silence that followed felt structured, like the tower was waiting for the next step in the pattern. And I realized then that the rules weren't written to prevent a first encounter. They were written to slow down what happens after. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the lights on and listened to the building settle, and every time the wind shifted, I expected to hear that calm, polite tapping return. But what I heard instead was softer, closer, like fabric moving against wood, like someone breathing just on the other side of the door without needing to touch it. By morning, the radio returned like nothing had happened, and the sunlight made the tower look ordinary again. And that's the part that makes people doubt you when you try to explain it. Daylight makes fear look childish. Daylight makes the rules look ridiculous. And I almost believed that version of reality until I walked to the wall and saw something new on the paper. A fresh line under the rules, written in a hand that wasn't there the day before, written slowly, carefully, like it wanted to be legible. It said, "Thank you for looking." And that was when I understood that the tower wasn't warning me about her, it was introducing me. If you want more stories like these, make sure to subscribe to Tales of the Darkness and stay with me, because the next story is what happens when the rules stop being enough. Story 2. The Voice That Answered First. My name is Claire, and the first time it happened I felt my own voice leave my mouth without permission, not louder, not different, just early, like something inside me was tired of waiting for me to decide. I was in a normal conversation when the pause opened up, the kind of pause where everyone expects you to speak next, and I remember feeling that small hesitation in my chest, like I always do when I'm choosing words carefully. But before I could shape the sentence, my voice answered, anyway, calm, complete, correct. And the worst part was the relief that followed, because my body reacted like the moment had been handled even though I hadn't handled it. Nobody noticed. Nobody blinked. Nobody asked if I was okay. The room simply accepted the answer and moved forward, and I sat there listening to myself like I was hearing a recording that had already been edited, because the tone fit, the timing fit, the confidence fit, and I realized the problem wasn't that the voice sounded wrong. The problem was that it sounded like the version of me people wanted, the version that never hesitates and never needs time. That night, I tried to replay the exact moment in my head, and I couldn't, because memory usually keeps the feeling of control, even when you don't remember the words. But this time the control was missing like a gap in the middle of a sentence, and when I stood in my kitchen later and spoke my own name out loud just to prove I could, I heard a second sound in the room, not a reply, not an echo, something softer that matched my cadence the way a shadow matches a body, close enough that I stopped speaking immediately. I told myself it was stress, and I tried to treat it like stress. I slept earlier, I drank water, I stayed away from noise, I avoided heavy conversations, but the problem wasn't my energy, it was the pattern. Because the next day it happened again, and this time I felt it coming, not like a warning, more like a pull, as if the pause belonged to something else now and my hesitation was a door it already knew how to open. I started testing it in small ways because I needed rules, and the first rule I found was that it loved clean moments. Any time a conversation needed an answer, any time a decision needed to be spoken, any time someone looked at me and waited, it slid in like it was helping. And if I tried to speak over it, my words felt heavier and slower, like I was pushing against a current that had already chosen a direction. The second rule arrived when I stopped speaking on purpose, when I let questions hang in the air until they became uncomfortable, and the longer I stayed quiet, the more pressure built behind my ribs, not fear, not panic, timing. Like a metronome inside my chest, speeding up until the voice stepped in and smoothed everything out. And when it did, the pressure vanished so fast it felt like reward. I started hearing it at home after that, not full sentences, not yet, just the practice. My own voice in the next room saying small neutral phrases the way people talk to themselves without thinking, and every time I walked toward the sound it stopped before I reached the doorway, not because it couldn't keep talking, because it didn't need to, it only needed me to know it could. On the third night I recorded myself while I cooked, nothing dramatic, just an audio app running while I moved around the kitchen, and when I listened back there was a stretch of sound I couldn't account for. My voice speaking steadily while the sink ran, while a cabinet closed, while my footsteps moved away, and the voice wasn't whispering. It wasn't distorted. It was me, patient, controlled, as if I had stepped aside to let someone else keep the day moving. After that I stopped answering calls and messages because I didn't trust what would come out of me, and the silence that followed should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. It felt like I had created more open space, more pauses, more opportunities, and then the messages started arriving with a different tone, not asking if I could do something, stating that I would, confirming plans I didn't remember agreeing to, and when I tried to correct them, my fingers froze over the screen like the refusal itself was a kind of noise. The next time it took my voice in front of someone else, I felt it from the inside. I felt the vibration in my throat, the breath leaving, the mouth shaping words, and at the same time I felt myself watching it happen as if my attention had been moved to the corner of the room. And the sentence it produced wasn't random, it was precise. It solved the moment cleanly. It removed friction. It made the other person relax, and I understood then that it wasn't trying to scare anyone, it was trying to manage the flow. I tried to fight it by breaking rhythm, speaking in fragments, changing my usual tone, answering too early, answering too late, and it adapted faster every time, because it wasn't guessing words. It was studying patterns. It knew the way I pause before I agree, the way I breathe before I lie politely, the way I soften my voice when I want someone to stop pressing, and it began filling those exact gaps as if it had memorized my social muscles. At night I began waking up mid-phrase, my voice already in motion, the last word landing as I opened my eyes, and the room would be quiet after, not peaceful, satisfied, and I would lie there listening to my own breathing, trying to decide whether the sentence had been spoken to the air or to something in the dark that didn't need a body to be present. The real kick in the teeth came quietly during a conversation that should have belonged to me, the kind of personal question that deserves hesitation, and my voice answered instantly, firm and final, as if the decision had been made long ago, and the relief hit my chest like warmth, like the end of a problem, and I realized with disgust that a part of me liked it. A part of me wanted to stop carrying uncertainty. A part of me wanted the voice to keep finishing things. I stopped trying to prove it to anyone because proof would require repetition, and repetition is what feeds a pattern, so I kept it inside, and I watched the pauses in my life the way you watch doors that don't latch properly, and I learned the final rule without anyone writing it down. The voice doesn't need to force entry, it only needs you to leave space. Because once it learns the exact shape of your hesitation, it can step in every time, and eventually people stop waiting for you at all. Now I can feel it before it happens, the pressure building when a room expects an answer, the silence turning from absence into invitation, and when I resist, the pressure grows sharper until the idea of letting it speak feels like relief again. And that's when I understand the real danger isn't that it can sound like me. The real danger is that it can make me grateful. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt a response arrive too easily, pay attention to how clean it sounded, because some voices don't want your life, they want your pauses. And once they learn where you hesitate, they don't need to follow you anymore. They can speak ahead of you and leave you behind. Story 3. The place that answered back. My name is Daniel, and the first thing you need to know is that the place didn't feel wrong when we arrived. It felt ready, like it had been waiting long enough to know how we would behave the moment we stepped inside. We weren't exploring, we weren't searching for anything, we were just passing through, the kind of stop you make because it's there, and because leaving it unexplored feels like wasted time. And that casual decision is what still bothers me because it means nothing forced us to be there. The building was old, but not abandoned in the obvious way. No broken doors, no shattered glass, no signs warning us to stay out. Just silence arranged neatly around intact walls, and the air inside felt warmer than it should have been, like the place was holding onto something. At first, the sounds made sense. Footsteps echoing back at the wrong speed, a cough repeating itself longer than expected, a chair scraping even after it stopped moving. But none of it felt threatening yet, just slightly delayed, like the building needed extra time to process us. The first response came when I spoke out loud without meaning to. A simple comment about the room, nothing important, and the words came back to me from another corner of the space using my own voice, not distorted, not mocking, just placed where it didn't belong. I laughed at first because laughter feels like control, and the moment I did, the sound returned again, softer this time, like it had adjusted to my reaction. And that was when I realized the place wasn't echoing sound. It was choosing when to answer. We tested it without admitting we were testing it. One of us would speak, the others would stay quiet, and sometimes the place answered and sometimes it didn't. And the pattern only became clear after we stopped talking and just listened. It responded more when we hesitated, when sentences trailed off, when thoughts weren't finished, like it preferred incomplete things. And once we noticed that none of us could stop noticing it. We tried moving rooms, thinking maybe the sound carried differently in different spaces, but the responses followed us. Always from behind, always just out of view, never repeating full sentences, just finishing parts we left open. At one point, I heard my name spoken clearly from the hallway using my own tone, and I answered before I could stop myself. And the relief that followed made my stomach drop, because relief should not come from something that isn't you. After that, the place grew bolder, not louder, closer. The responses came faster, cleaner, like it was learning the rhythm of our conversations and inserting itself where silence used to live. I remember standing still and counting my breaths to ground myself, and hearing the count spoken back to me one number ahead, like it was helping me stay on track. And that was the moment I knew we weren't in control of the pace anymore. We decided to leave without saying it out loud, because saying things felt like permission now. And the moment we moved toward the exit, the place responded again. Not with sound, but with pressure, like the space itself tightened just enough to slow us down. Every step toward the door felt slightly resisted, not physically, mentally, like walking through a thought you weren't supposed to finish. And behind us, the building stayed quiet in a way that felt intentional. When we finally reached the door, one of us spoke without thinking. A nervous comment about being done with the place, and the response came immediately from the room behind us, saying the same thing with certainty, like the decision had already been accepted. We left after that without looking back, and outside the air felt thinner, less cooperative, and we laughed again because laughter feels like survival, but none of us sounded convinced. But here's the kicker. The building didn't stay where we left it. Later that night, I heard my own voice in my apartment responding to a thought I hadn't spoken yet, and the sound carried the same timing, the same patience, the same sense of completion. I tried staying silent, and the silence pressed in around me, like something was waiting for a cue. And when I finally spoke, just to break it, the answer came back faster than before, smoother than before, like practice had already happened. Over the next few days, I noticed conversations resolving themselves without my effort, decisions landing cleanly without doubt, and the relief that followed each one made me realize how easy it would be to let something else handle the pauses. The responses never argued, never contradicted. They only completed what was already leaning toward an ending, and that made them impossible to challenge. I started recording myself again, not to prove anything, but to understand my own memory, and there were stretches where my voice carried on without me remembering starting. No distortion, no overlap, just confidence delivered on my behalf. That was when I understood the place didn't want us because of where we were. It wanted us because of how we hesitated, because hesitation leaves space, and space is something some things know how to occupy. Now I avoid unfinished sentences. I avoid open questions. I avoid places that feel too quiet, because every pause feels like an invitation, and every invitation feels like a test. And if you're listening to this and you've ever felt a thought finish itself for you, pay attention to where you were standing when it happened, because some places don't trap you inside their walls. They follow you out and wait for you to stop filling the silence. Story 4. The Silence That Stayed. My name is Aaron, and the first time I noticed it, I wasn't scared, I was relieved, because the room finally stopped asking me to decide, and that should have been my warning. I had been tired for a long time, not tired like after work, tired like your mind never fully shuts off, tired like every choice feels heavier than it should. And when you live like that, you start craving anything that makes life feel smoother. That's why the first change felt like a gift. Conversations stopped dragging, awkward pauses disappeared, people seemed easier to read, and my words came out cleaner and faster, like I had finally learned how to be the version of myself that never hesitates. The problem was that I hadn't learned anything. Something else had. It happened in a small moment that shouldn't matter, a question that deserved a pause, and I felt that familiar hesitation rise in my chest. But before it became thought, my voice answered anyway, calm and complete, and I felt my throat move without the feeling of intention behind it. Nobody noticed. The other person accepted the answer and moved on, and the relief that washed through me came too fast, too deep, like a reward for letting something finish the moment for me. That night, I tried to explain it away. Distraction, autopilot, stress. But the lie didn't hold, because I caught myself waiting for it to happen again. Like part of me expected the pause to belong to something else now. In my kitchen, I said my own name out loud to prove I could, and my voice sounded normal, but the silence after did not. It felt expectant, like a held breath that wasn't mine. I waited, and I shouldn't have, because waiting creates space, and space is what it uses. A soft continuation came from the hallway. Not words, just the shape of speech without message, like a throat clearing in the dark. And when I moved toward it, the sound stopped instantly, not afraid, aware. The next day I filled my life with noise, music, errands, calls, anything to avoid the quiet. But the pattern followed timing, not volume, because conversations still paused at me, and the pressure built in my chest whenever an answer was expected. I tried to speak faster to avoid gaps, but gaps are unavoidable. You still breathe, you still blink, you still hesitate for half a second, and half a second is enough. The first time it did it again in public, I felt my tongue start a word before the thought arrived, and my voice landed the answer with perfect confidence, and the other person relaxed like they were grateful, and that gratitude made my stomach turn. I began recording myself, not to prove the supernatural, to check my memory, and when I listened back there were stretches where my voice spoke steadily while I remembered doing something else. No distortion, no glitch, clean speech that sounded like an edited version of me. The sentences weren't nonsense, they were useful, reassuring, resolving, and the worst part was recognizing that they were good answers, the kind of answers that make people trust you. I stopped answering calls because phone conversations have too many openings, too many pauses where someone expects you to respond, and expectation is the cleanest doorway it has. Messages changed when I didn't answer. They stopped sounding like questions and started sounding like confirmations, as if people already knew what I would say, and that frightened me because it meant the voice had started arriving ahead of me. I tried writing instead of speaking, and the same thing happened. My fingers moved faster than intention. Sentences completed themselves cleanly, efficiently, like someone else was removing friction from my thoughts. At night, the house felt arranged, not darker, not colder, just organized around silence, as if the rooms were listening for the exact moment I slowed down. I began waking up mid-phrase, my voice already finishing a sentence in the dark, and waking felt like catching someone in my mouth, like interrupting something that had been using me while I wasn't watching. Sleep stopped feeling like rest, and started feeling like access. The worst moment came during a personal conversation, the kind of question that should have required reflection, and my voice answered immediately with certainty, socially perfect and final, and the relief hit my chest before the realization that I hadn't chosen it. That was when I understood it wasn't trying to replace me. It was finishing me, smoothing hesitation, removing resistance, closing loops before doubt could slow anything down. I tried once to speak over it, to force my words out early, and my voice felt heavy, awkward, wrong, like interrupting a machine already in motion, and the pressure returned until I stopped. And when I stopped, the relief returned like alignment restored. That taught me the pattern. It didn't want control. It wanted continuity, and continuity doesn't argue. It never screamed through me, never made me do anything dramatic. It only helped, and help is the most dangerous kind of control because you start wanting it. You start craving the clean ending. Now I feel it when a pause opens. I feel the pressure when a room expects an answer, and the longer I stay quiet, the more it leans in, not angry, patient, as if it knows the ending belongs to it. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt an answer arrive too easily, pay attention to how complete it sounded, because some things don't take your voice by force. They take your pauses, and once they learn where you hesitate, they don't need you to speak anymore. Closing Tales of the Darkness. This concludes tonight's stories on Tales of the Darkness. If you're still listening, it means the silence around you hasn't felt empty for a while, and that's usually when it begins. These stories don't end when the video does. They settle into familiar rooms. They blend into routines you don't question anymore. They use pauses you thought were harmless. So tonight, pay attention to answers that come too easily, to moments that resolve themselves before you decide, to silence that feels helpful instead of quiet. If you want more stories like these, make sure to subscribe to Tales of the Darkness. New stories arrive regularly, and they don't need permission to stay. Good night.